Imagine the scene, a huge cargo jet, one of those brown tail UPS planes we see all the time, coming in for landing in Birmingham, Alabama, an airport they know well, runway lights are right there, everything seems fine. But instead of landing, it flies right into the ground. Half a mile short, this is back in August 2013, UPS Flight 1354. Both pilots, tragically, died.
Yeah.
And what's so, I guess, shocking is how unexpected it feels. How does a modern plane, big airline like UPS, just fly into the dirt with the runway practically in sight?
That's really the core question, isn't it? You immediately think, well, how?
Yeah.
How, in an industry that's just built on safety layer after safety layer, does this kind of accident happen?
Exactly. And as we take this deep dive into the NTSB investigation findings, using the material you've shared, you start to see it wasn't like one single failure. It was more like a chain reaction, a cascade of things.
Right. And what the report really hammers home is the powerful, sometimes kind of hidden influence of human factors, especially fatigue, how that can override even sophisticated technology and, established procedures.
It's such a stark reminder, isn't it, that even with these incredibly advanced planes, the human in the cockpit is still absolutely critical.
Absolutely. So this deep dive, it isn't just about the mechanics, the what happened. It's really about understanding that interplay between the pilot's performance, the technology they were using, and crucially, those organizational factors, like how fatigue is managed or not managed in the, let's face it, demanding world of cargo flying.
Okay, so our mission here is to pull out the most important insights from all this material, right? To give you, the listener, a clear picture of the lessons learned, a shortcut, almost.
Precisely. Let's get into the why it matters.
Okay, let's do it. Now, we all know UPS from the brown trucks, obviously, but they're also a huge cargo airline, certified, massive fleet, one of the world's biggest. The plane here was an A300.
And a really key difference compared to passenger airlines is just the nature of their business. It's all about moving packages quickly, expedited delivery.
Which often means flying at night.
Exactly. Overnight, when the passenger traffic is lighter, packages, as you said, they don't complain about the red eye.
Right, they don't need sleep. But pilots do.
And that puts pilots right up against their own biology, their circadian rhythms. They're consistently operating during that window when the body is screaming for sleep.
Okay, so the crew on this flight, 1354, Captain Syria Beale Jr., 58 years old, and First Officer Shonda Fanning, 37.
Both very experienced pilots. We're talking thousands of flight hours. They'd even been flight engineers before. The report describes them as average pilots.
Which sounds maybe not great, but in this context.
It's actually significant because in a highly regulated system with rigorous training, average should be perfectly fine. It has to be fine for the system to work. There's nothing in the record suggesting they were, problem pilots.
Okay, but the cockpit voice recorder, the CVR, from the very beginning, even before they took off, the conversation turns straight to one thing.
Fatigue, yeah, right away.
The captain mentions their schedule, points out they only had a 14-hour rest period before this flight.
And he specifically mentions the new FAA rest rules, the ones that had just been updated for passenger airlines, but crucially excluded cargo operations.
And you can hear the first officer chime in, totally agreeing. She says something like, it should be one level of safety for everybody. Doesn't matter if you're flying passengers or cargo or, a box of chocolates.
That line really sticks with you. It just captures that frustration, that feeling of a double standard.
Yeah. And she was even more direct about how she was feeling, right?
Oh, yeah. She explicitly says she felt so tired, even after what she thought was decent sleep the night before in Rockford. She kind of contrasts it, saying it's not like a long flight where you'd expect to be tired.
And the investigation later found text messages that backed this up. Like, this wasn't just a passing comment.
No, it seemed to be a persistent issue for her, this feeling of tiredness.
And the captain, he seemed to get it.
He acknowledged it, yeah, saying people have no clue about their kind of schedule. And he links it directly to the company, saying it says a lot about how they think about you, implying, cost over well-being.
Wow. Okay, so setting that context, they take off from Louisville. It's just after 4 a.m., autopilot's on, heading for Birmingham. Pretty standard departure.
Standard procedure, yeah. But then, about 18 minutes into the flight, they get the latest ATIS, the airport information for Birmingham.
And that's when they find out about the runway.
That's when they discover the main runway, 624, is actually closed for maintenance.
Yeah.
Right when they're scheduled to arrive, between 4 and 5 a.m.
Ah. Okay, so plan B, they have to switch runways?
To runway 18, and this is a huge factor. Runway 18 did not have a full instrument landing system, an ILS.
Okay, explain that. An ILS gives you...
It gives you both lateral guidance, keeps you lined up left and right, and vertical guidance, the glide path down to the runway. Really precise.
The Runway 18 only had...
Just the localizer. So it gave them the left-right guidance, but no automated glide path.
Yeah.
No electronic beam telling them how high to be.
So that makes it a non-precision approach.
Exactly. Which puts much more responsibility on the pilots. They had to manage their descent manually, essentially. They needed to set up their own virtual glide path using the plane's computer, the FMC.
The flight management computer.
Okay.
So more workload, more monitoring needed.
Significantly more, yes.
Oh.
Especially compared to just following the needles on a full ILS.
All right. So First Officer Fanning, it was her job to program this new approach into the FMC.
Correct. And she successfully loads the Runway 18 localizer approach data into the computer. That part goes okay.
But there was another step.
A really critical step for this kind of approach. She needs to sequence it properly. The approach procedure has specific waypoints, like virtual breadcrumbs in the sky leading to the runway. One key waypoint was colleague, marking where that final descent path begins. Sequencing tells the computer, okay, follow these points in this order.
And the mistake was...
She essentially forgot to properly sequence it. She left the original destination waypoint, KBHM, the code for Birmingham Airport in general, before colleague in the programmed route.
So the computer's flight plan was sort of broken. It had a gap.
Pretty much. It created what's called a flight plan discontinuity error. The computer thought it still needed to fly towards the general KBHM point first, which wasn't part of the actual approach path to runway 18.
Okay, and the investigation found clues, warnings they should have picked up on.
Yeah, there were several signs this wasn't right. First, there was an extra white line showing up on their navigation displays, pointing back towards that old KBHM waypoint, not where they should be going.
Right. What else?
The FMC screens themselves, the little computer displays, actually showed a message, FPLN discontinuity.
Yeah.
Pretty clear warning.
And the distance readout?
That was off too. It was showing the distance to the old waypoint, not the actual distance along the approach path to the runway.
Okay, and then there was the issue with the vertical deviation indicators, the VDIs, the things showing if they're high or low.
Yes, this gets a bit technical, but it's crucial. Because the computer was confused by that discontinuity, it thought they were much farther away from the runway than they actually were.
Right, because it still had that wrong waypoint in there.
Exactly. So the VDI, which shows your position relative to the calculated glide path, was telling them they were way below that path.
But they knew they weren't.
Correct. They knew they were actually still high, needing to descend. So you have this really confusing, contradictory indication. The instrument says you're way low, but your altitude and position tell you you're high. It was a direct result of that discontinuity messing up the computer's calculation.
A confusing signal. Why didn't they catch these things? The discontinuity message, the weird VDI.
Well, the NTSB report suggests distraction was a key factor. Right around the time the sequencing mistake likely happened, the CVR picked up the first officer, initiating some lighthearted, unrelated chat with the captain.
Okay. And later, when the VDI cues were most obvious...
Later on, closer to the airport, when those strange indications would have been really apparent, they were actually talking about something else entirely, a minor operational thing about ATC keeping them high on previous flights into Birmingham.
So they were kind of fixated on this idea of being kept too high, maybe from past experience?
It seems like it. Their attention was diverted. Their minds were sort of elsewhere, focused on that unrelated issue instead of diagnosing the conflicting information right in front of them.
And the fix for the discontinuity?
Oh, we would have been simple. Literally seconds. Just go into the FMC, find that incorrect KBHM waypoint, and delete it. That's it. Plan fixed.
Wow. Simple fix, but missed. Okay, so they're flying towards Birmingham. They get cleared to descend further. They level off at 2,500 feet, and they do manage to line up with the runway laterally using the localizer.
Correct. They intercept the localizer. Now, according to UPS's own procedures for this non-precision approach, once they were established on the localizer, they should have descended further to 2,300 feet.
But they didn't.
Yeah, they stayed at 2,500 feet, which, again, probably reinforced that feeling Captain Beale had about being kept too high by ATC, even though ATC wasn't a factor at this point.
Okay. Then they reach a point called BASKN. That's the final approach fix, the spot where you start the final descent.
That's it. And this is where the vertical control really starts to go wrong. Captain Beale tries to engage the autopilot's profile approach mode. That's the mode that should follow the pre-programmed vertical path.
But it wouldn't engage because of the discontinuity. The path was broken.
Exactly. The computer couldn't follow a broken path. But instead of stopping, figuring out why it didn't engage, Captain Beale immediately and crucially switches the autopilot to a different mode, vertical speed.
And he didn't announce this switch.
The CVR doesn't record him announcing it first. He just selects vertical speed mode and manually dials in a descent rate. First height of at 1,000 feet per minute, then he quickly increases it to negative 1,500 feet per minute.
1,500 feet per minute? That sounds steep for a final approach.
It is quite steep. And this is that dive and drive technique the report talks about.
Right. Explain that again briefly.
It's an older technique. You basically descend quickly, nose down to your minimum allowed altitude in the MDA, then level off abruptly and fly level towards the runway, hoping you see it.
Versus the recommended way.
UPS, like most airlines now, advocated for a continuous descent approach, a smoother, constant angle descent all the way down. It generally involves less workload at the critical low altitude phase. Dive and drive requires intense monitoring when you level off near the ground.
Which the report suggests Captain Beale wasn't really set up for.
The NTSB felt his actions didn't show the heightened vigilance needed for that technique.
Okay, but the first officer, Fanning, she does eventually notice the mode change.
She does, yeah. A little later, she says something like, let's see, you're in vertical speed. Okay. They talk about it briefly, and again, the captain brings up being kept high, fixated on it.
And she checks the altitude against the approach chart.
Yes. She cross-references their altitude with the chart for their distance from the runway. She notes they're about a couple hundred feet higher than the charted altitude profile at that point.
But that check doesn't seem to raise alarm bells about the rate they're descending.
Apparently not. It seems the focus was still on being slightly high, not on the very rapid rate they were closing that altitude gap.
Okay, so fast forward a few seconds. She makes the standard 1,000 feet call out. That's 1,000 feet above the airport elevation rate. So they're at 1,750 feet above sea level.
Correct. And they are still plummeting at negative 1,500 feet per minute towards their minimum descent altitude, the MDA, which for this approach was 1,200 feet above sea level.
And at just 11 seconds after she says 1,000 feet.
In just 11 seconds, they've already descended through the virtual glide path they should have been following, and now they are significantly below it and still going down fast.
That's incredibly quick descent.
It is. That managed 1,500 feet per minute rate basically cut the time they had during that final descent phase in half, compressed everything.
And this is where the first officer's role, the monitoring role, becomes absolutely critical again.
Hugely critical. Because she was supposed to be making altitude call-outs as they descended further.
But because everything was happening so fast.
The investigation concluded she just wasn't prepared for that compressed timeline. After that single 1,000 feet call, she made none of the other required call-outs. Not at 500 feet above minimums, not approaching minimums, and crucially, not at the minimum descent altitude, the MDA itself.
So Captain Beale, who was flying, didn't get those verbal warnings about how low they actually were.
Exactly. His altitude awareness was compromised because those standard call-outs were missing.
Okay, add to this mix a misunderstanding about the weather.
Right. Based on the weather report they received, they were expecting the cloud base to be around 1,000 feet above the ground. They thought they'd break out and see the runway then.
But there was a problem with that report.
Yes, another systemic issue flagged by the NTSB. UPS's dispatch software, the system that sends weather to pilots, automatically removed the remarks section from the official weather reports.
And the remarks section is important because...
In this case, the remarks specifically noted a variable cloud ceiling, meaning it wasn't uniformly at the 1,000 feet, it could be lower in patches.
So without that crucial detail, they weren't mentally prepared for clouds being lower than 1,000 feet.
Correct. And the consequence was, after they passed 1,000 feet, both pilots seemed to focus their attention almost entirely outside the cockpit, scanning intensely for the runway lights they expected to see any second.
But that's precisely the time the first officer needed to be glued to the instruments inside.
Exactly. Monitoring their rapidly decreasing altitude, making those vital call-outs as they approached and then passed the MDA. Instead, both pairs of eyes were looking outside.
And the actual weather they encountered.
Turned out there was a localized patch of clouds hanging right over the final approach pass with a base much lower, around 350 feet above the ground.
So they busted through their minimum altitude, still in cloud, desperately looking outside. Things must have unfolded incredibly quickly from that point.
Extremely fast. From the moment they descended below the MDA to hitting the trees was only about 20 seconds, maybe less.
20 seconds? What about the plane's warning systems? The EGPWS, the ground proximity warning.
Okay, so about 8 seconds before impact with the first trees, the enhanced ground proximity warning system, the EGPWS, did activate. It gave an audible alert. Sink rate. Sink rate.
Because they were descending too rapidly near the ground. Did the captain react to that?
He did react. He pulled back slightly on the controls, reducing the descent rate. First to about an extra 600 feet per minute, then further to an extra 400 feet per minute.
But the report found an issue with that response.
Yes, a significant one. The UPS operations manual, their procedure book, stated that the only required response to a sink rate alert during an approach was simply to decrease the rate of descent.
Which sounds reasonable.
It sounds reasonable, but it directly contradicted the aircraft manufacturer's guidance. Honeywell, who made the EGPWS, recommended a much more aggressive response, typically initiating an immediate go-around, applying full power, and climbing away.
And could a go-around have actually worked at that point, 8 seconds out?
The NTSB analysis showed, yes, it was potentially survivable. If they had executed a maximum performance go-around the instant that sink rate alert sounded, calculations showed they likely would have cleared the trees.
But Captain Beale's response, following the arguably flawed UPS procedure,
was insufficient to arrest the descent in time.
did they ever actually see the runway?
Yes. Just moments before impact, the plane broke through the base of that low cloud layer. The CVR records both pilots calling out that they saw the runway lights.
Oh, heartbreaking to see it right there.
But tragically, in that split second between breaking out of the cloud and seeing the runway, they had already descended too far. They crossed the point of no return. The impact was inevitable.
So, beyond the human factors, the procedural issues, the report really dug into the equipment side too, particularly that EGPWS.
It really did.
Yeah.
And found some pretty concerning things. As we said, the main too low terrain warning, the one you really don't want to hear, it only sounded after they'd already started hitting the trees.
Which is obviously way too late. Why so late?
A couple of reasons. The system's terrain clearance settings, the sort of safety bubble around the plane, were set relatively low for operations near airports. Combined with their unusually high descent rate, they just closed the gap too quickly for the standard warning logic.
But there was an update available.
Yes, and this was a major point for the NTSB. Honeywell had released an updated software package for the EGPWS on the A300. This update specifically improved the warning logic, effectively raising the terrain floor setting near airports to give earlier warnings without causing nuisance alerts during normal operations.
And UPS hadn't installed it.
No. At the time of the accident, UPS had not installed this available safety-enhancing update on their A300 fleet. The NTSB used strong language, calling this failure incomprehensible for a major airline.
Did they calculate how much difference that update might have made?
They did. Their analysis showed that with the updated software, the too low terrain alert would likely have sounded about 6.5 seconds earlier than the sink rate alert they actually got.
6.5 seconds earlier. That's significant time in that situation.
It's potentially life-saving time. An immediate forceful reaction to a terrain warning then. Well, it could possibly have changed the outcome.
And it wasn't just the missing update, was it? There were other standard callouts the system could have made.
Right. The EGPWS system has several optional but pretty standard altitude callouts that can be enabled. Things like automatically announcing 500 feet above the ground, or approaching minimums, or minimums right when you reach the MDA.
And UPS hadn't enabled those on their A300s.
No. None of those were active. They had also actively disabled the A300 aircraft's own built-in 400-foot altitude callout.
The NTSB reaction to that.
They were, quote, shocked that a major carrier like UPS would operate without these fairly basic altitude awareness aids. They felt strongly that having those callouts active would have provided critical reinforcement for the crew, especially the first officer, and likely prevented the descent below minimums without visual contact.
Okay, so we've got the flight plan error, the procedural problems, the technology issues, but the NTSB keeps circling back to the underlying factor that likely contributed to many of these mistakes.
Pilot fatigue, yes. The board concluded fatigue was a significant contributing factor, degrading the performance of both pilots, but especially the first officer.
Let's break that down. Captain Beale's fatigue. He had mentioned the tough schedules.
He had. He told colleagues the schedules were killing him, talked about the difficulty of flip-flopping between day and night duties. However, the investigation also found he had tried to use fatigue mitigation strategies. And crucially, he appeared to have gotten over 8 hours of sleep, before this specific flight.
So his issue wasn't necessarily lack of sleep that night?
Probably not acute sleep deprivation. His fatigue was likely more related to the chronic effects of the schedule and, importantly, the unavoidable impact of operating during the window of circadian low, that period between roughly 2:30 and 5 a.m. when human alertness and cognitive function are naturally at their lowest, regardless of prior sleep. Error rates just go up then.
But First Officer Fanning, the report describes her situation as a completely different story.
Yeah, it really sounds like it was. The NTSB painted a picture of severe chronic fatigue. And controversially, perhaps, they linked it quite strongly, in hindsight, to what appears to be a form of smartphone addiction.
Smartphone addiction. That's a strong claim. How do they justify that?
Well, they pulled her phone records. Telecom data showed she was spending, up to 8 hours a day on her phone. Critically, this included significant usage during designated rest periods when she absolutely should have been sleeping.
Wow. And colleagues corroborated this?
Colleagues reported she had admitted sometimes struggling to stay awake on the flight deck. And her text messages, plus testimony from her husband, confirmed she frequently complained about being tired. Fatigue was her default state, as her husband put it.
There was that example from a layover.
Right, the San Antonio layover. It was a long one, 62 hours. She flew somewhere else for personal reasons during it, came back, and complained about sleeping constantly. But her phone records for that same period showed really heavy usage.
So the NTSB interpreted that as
pointing towards a potential compulsive behavior, maybe an addiction. She clearly recognized she was tired. She expressed wanting sleep, but seemed unable or unwilling to disconnect from the phone long enough to get adequate rest.
And the timeline just before the accident flight is grim.
Extremely. The report lays it out. Awake 13 hours, followed by maybe only 2 hours sleep, then working a 9.5-hour shift. That same day, she texts a friend saying she'd pay big money to sleep, admitting she'd missed a nap opportunity because she was on her phone.
Oh, man.
Then the next day, she has a 14.5-hour rest period before the accident trip. A good opportunity. But the analysis suggests she likely only got 4 to 5 hours of sleep during that time, adding to an already significant sleep debt. Then a short duty period, followed by probably less than 2 hours of sleep before reporting for the flight to Birmingham.
The NTSB called her an absolute wreck.
It's blunt language, but based on that sleep history, it seems tragically accurate. The board concluded this profound lack of rest resulted in severe fatigue, which significantly impaired her ability to monitor the flight, catch errors, and perform her required duties, especially those critical callouts during the approach. They raised the possibility it was pathological.
And then you combine her severe fatigue with Captain Beale's specific weaknesses.
Exactly. While Captain Beale was generally competent, his training records did show documented difficulties specifically with non-precision approaches in the simulator. Things like using the altimeter incorrectly, getting behind the aircraft, using vertical speed mode inappropriately, descending below minimums, poor communication about descent profiles.
The very same types of errors he made on Flight 1354.
Precisely the same errors. So the NTSB saw this terrible convergence. A captain with known vulnerabilities in this specific, challenging type of approach, paired with a first officer whose ability to provide backup and monitoring was severely compromised by fatigue on a flight that unexpectedly required exactly that type of challenging approach. It created the conditions for disaster.
And this wasn't just about these two individuals, right? The NTSB looked broader at systemic fatigue issues within UPS.
They did. They checked if UPS was pushing duty limits or violating regulations, and generally, they weren't. The bigger issue seemed to be the culture and the system around pilots reporting fatigue, calling in sick because you're too tired to fly safely.
Even though pilots said fatigue was an epidemic, many, like Fanning, apparently never used the fatigue reporting system.
Right. The official policy was, sure, call in fatigue if you need to. But you then had to file a fatigue event report. That report would be reviewed by management to determine if the pilot was somehow responsible for their own fatigue, like through poor planning or, yes, maybe excessive phone use during rest.
And if they decided you were responsible,
then the missed trip could be debited against your sick leave bank. Plus, there was a company bonus program rewarding pilots for having unused sick leave at the end of the year.
So a potential financial disincentive to report fatigue, especially if you felt it might be judged as your own fault.
Exactly. It could discourage reporting. And a survey conducted by the Pilots Union with huge participation found 91% of respondents felt the company culture did not genuinely encourage reporting fatigue.
Pilots who had used this system felt hesitant to do it again.
Some did, yes. Two of the 6 pilots interviewed who had previously called in fatigued expressed reluctance to repeat the experience. The NTSB's view was clear. The system, as it existed, was flawed and needed reform. It wasn't truly non-punitive.
Okay, so after all this, in the aftermath, what actually changed? Did things improve?
Well, UPS did finally install that updated EGPWS software on their A300s. That was a concrete step.
And the NTSB made recommendations.
20 of them, yes. Covering a range of areas, things like requiring pilots on overnight flights to specifically brief the fatigue threat before departure, urging all airlines to activate those minimums alerts on their EGPWS, asking Airbus to look at clearer warnings for FMC programming errors.
And specifically recommending UPS work with the union on fixing that fatigue reporting system.
Yes, that was a key recommendation. But the report notes this became a major point of contention. UPS management and the union leadership apparently couldn't agree on how to reform the system while balancing genuine reporting needs against potential abuse. UPS largely denied a systemic problem existed, accused the union of politicizing the tragedy.
And the NTSB had to step in.
It got so bad that the NTSB actually removed both UPS management and the union from participating further in the investigation as parties, citing their inability to cooperate constructively on this critical safety issue.
Wow. There was a quote from one of the NTSB board members, Robert Sumwalt, who later became chairman.
Yes, a very pointed statement. He acknowledged that the law exempting cargo pilots from the stricter rest rules wasn't the direct cause here, since Fanning's issues seemed self-induced. But, he said, when you have over 80% of pilots reporting a problem with fatigue culture, then a problem exists. He famously stated, "Denial is the enemy of change," and urged UPS to work proactively to improve conditions, not just deny the issues raised.
Has UPS had any major accidents since then? Has the culture shifted at all?
Thankfully, no. UPS hasn't had another fatal hull loss accident since 1354. Informally, you hear within the pilot community that this crash, sometimes grimly referred to as the fatigue accident, did have an impact. It perhaps made individual pilots more aware and maybe more willing to call in fatigued, even if the formal system didn't drastically change overnight.
But that fundamental challenge remains, doesn't it? For cargo pilots flying demanding schedules, often through the night, disrupting their natural sleep patterns.
Absolutely. That core issue isn't resolved. The material really underscores the ongoing need for truly proactive approaches. Robust, non-punitive reporting systems are essential. But also, personal responsibility pilots need strategies to manage rest and avoid detrimental habits, like we saw with the phone use, that sabotage sleep.
And it highlights how incredibly difficult it is for any of us, really, to accurately judge our own impairment when we're significantly fatigued.
It's so true. We all tend to think, I can handle it, or the worst case won't happen to me, that denial somewhat mentioned. But the tragic reality is, it did happen to the crew of UPS 1354.
This deep dive, it really has peeled back so many layers. You see how this sequence of, seemingly small things, a missed button press on a computer, staying a couple 100 feet high, choosing one autopilot mode over another, software not updated, CalOps missed how they all lined up.
And how they were amplified, really enabled, by that invisible but powerful force of fatigue. Fatigue stemming from schedules, yes, but also from personal habits and maybe systemic cultural pressures around reporting it. It all converged right at the most critical phase of flight on a more demanding type of approach.
So you, our listener, have now journeyed through the complex factors behind this tragedy. You've seen the interplay of the human, the machine, and the organization.
It's not just about what happened, but understanding the deeper why.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Reflect on those unseen forces we've talked about. The relentless tick of the human body clock, the subtle, sometimes unspoken pressures within an organization's culture. How much do these quiet factors operating beneath the surface of our complex, technology-reliant world truly shape safety and performance? Not just on a flight deck, but in hospitals, control rooms, boardrooms, anywhere demanding vigilance and critical decision-making. What can this tragic story teach us all about recognizing risk, building resilience, and ensuring the vital human element is supported, not undermined?